Hey, this is Jack Naglieri. I'm the founder of Panther, a cybersecurity company based in San Francisco, California, and you're listening to the DiscoPosse Podcast.
All right, my day can officially begin. So this is perfect. So Jack, thank you very much for joining. I've been doing a lot of work in some of the stuff that I've been doing for my clients and just always keeping my eyes and ears on the industry. And more, Panther keeps coming up. And I finally said, okay, this is it. Why have I not gotten in front of these folks more? And then I realized, yeah, this is definitely so. Thankfully, reached out, your team connected me with you, and I really appreciate you jumping on. For folks that are brand new to you, Jack, if you want to do a quick intro, and then we'll talk about kind of the Panther story, which is really interesting unto itself in the way that you're solving problems. And also just, this is a really interesting area of study for a lot of people, and I would love to help people understand, like, actually what can we do about this stuff. We're in a weird world where everybody has, top three things to keep yourself secure, and it's be careful, trust less, and capture logs. So like, okay, that's actually not helpful. So with that, over to you, Jack.
Yeah, Eric, thank you so much for having me on. Really excited to talk with you today, share a little bit about the story with the company and the team we're working on. So I've been working in security my whole career. I started as an intern in college. I went to George Mason University, a school back in the DC metro area, for those who are familiar with that. And I ended up moving to California in 2012 to work for a company called Yahoo. And people listening might know that company. They had, couple billion users, and they had some interesting news stories too around that time that I was there, and really cut my teeth doing security analyst work, forensics, wearing a lot of the different types of hats on security teams, and doing a lot with SIEM. I've always done work in SIEM, even from my first internship in college. I was just given a screen of alerts and said, like, okay, let's go triage this and let's go reimage machines and let's just kind of learn about what a compromise really means. And I did that for many years, led me to Airbnb, and I worked on the security team there for about 2.5 years. And then I founded a company called Panther. Panther Labs is sometimes how we're known. That's like our official company name, but just more commonly we're referred to as Panther. And what Panther is a lot of the extensions of what I worked on in my career. So it's a cloud-based SIEM, and our really big focus is around like super high scalability, detection as code, and more developer-oriented security workflows. We can talk through all about the evolution and things like that. I founded the company in August of 2018, so it's been about 6 years, which is pretty wild. It's the most time I've spent at any company. And
It's amazing how time turns, weeks turn into months and turn into years. But
yeah,
and they've been a tumultuous 6 years in world economics and a lot of
yep,
conditions and technology shifts. So
yeah.
wow, you've seen a lot even in what some would think is a short time, but it's a lifetime in startup world.
It's very true. Yeah, the pandemic. I mean, going into 2020, we were a really small team, and I actually raised my Series A during the pandemic and my Series B, I guess, kind of on like post vaccines and getting more into the real life world again.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a really intense experience. And then so many things with the market going, up and down, and all of the post-pandemic challenges, the SVB collapse. It's just like every year there was some big thing. And I think just in most startups, you have to figure out the challenge of that year every year. So it's been a really remarkable experience. And I've had the privilege of working around some really talented, smart individuals, and that's been really inspiring.
Well, and looking at your origins too, it's always what I think is the best success pathway for a startup is somebody who really truly lived the experience of the problem. It's not that that has to occur, but I find that especially in a very technical platform as you've got, they're technical users, technical implementation. There's less marketing, more like real results that you have to show. There's marketing around it, obviously, but the core of it, it's a very different type of approach. And because you've lived those CLI, pouring through log files, learning, as I do, that I don't know enough about grep, but I relearn it every time I have to use it. When you look at those things, then falling in love with the problem allows you to then really look at the solution in a way of, I know what it felt like to experience this pain, and now I understand the journey, which is really, really hard to lay out. A lot of startup founders really struggle, like, our product's amazing. Why isn't everybody just buying it? So you're like, well, because we actually have to genuinely improve somebody's life. It sounds kind of crazy, but that's, what can we do then when we talk about delighting customers? But then you also came from very large scale companies that had like really diverse front end offerings. So you got to see the business side. I'm curious, when you were on the technology, like as a practitioner, how much did you kind of look out into business and overall operations to understand where that impact sat?
It's a good question. I think at the time of being a practitioner was so early in my career that I was very focused on solving the security problems and less so thinking about building a business around it. It was really just about, I was just kind of a technologist, a security nerd, trying to, get into coding, get into DevOps, and solve problems at a really high scale. And then, the business opportunity kind of presented itself after that moment. So it wasn't very proactive. I always wanted to do my own thing. I've always been a builder and enjoyed creating things just in general. It doesn't have to be in tech, just I've enjoyed creating. Like I love to cook as an example. Like I love creating like a dish or I've
Nice.
been baking a lot of bread and things like that. I don't know, just to get a lot of joy and satisfaction of like creating something that people enjoy. And that's always been something that's been very core to me. And insecurity always felt like it was just a genuine interest and something that I spent a lot of time in. And we had really hard problems to solve at Yahoo and Airbnb. And Airbnb, especially being the hyper growth, hyper scale cloud startup, and then being a multi-billion-dollar public company after. So it was very inspiring to watch that, and I think there was a lot of lessons that we all picked up along the way, just being in the company at that time and hearing Brian Chesky talk through the journey that he was also going through as CEO. So I think I certainly picked up some chops along the way there, and then yeah, the opportunity kind of presented itself to get into startups and kind of see the other side of Silicon Valley through that. So that was really interesting. It's been a wild journey.
Did you choose where you began sort of based on company profile, or were you more looking for like functionally this is where you really enjoyed working?
What do you mean by that?
Were you saying my kind of goal was to get into a high growth startup, or was it more just
Mm,
like that happened to be like I want to do this thing and it's more likely to occur at these companies?
that's a good question. I I think I just wanted to change from Yahoo, to be honest. Yahoo is a really big company, and I learned a ton of amazing things from those people. They were some of the smartest people I've ever worked with in my career, technically. Like they do incredible work. And I was just looking for something new, and I like the idea of going to a smaller company, having a little bit more ownership around the problems that we could solve. Kind of getting thrown into a whole new environment was really enticing too, especially going from a big company that was very data center centric into a company that's fully cloud centric. So a lot to learn there. And like most engineers, we just want to learn and solve problems. That's kind of what motivates us to do our jobs. And the Airbnb opportunity presented itself, and it was really interesting, and I took it, and that kind of led me to the next space of like startup and cloud native.
When you started with, when using SIEM as a sort of platform in practice and even in your early work, did you find you were sort of getting direction from what was probably new was CISOs, right? Like CISOs were fairly fresh. Well, actually not that. They're a little, I'm an old fella. So I remember the first time hearing a CISO and people were like, what is, like I don't even understand what that means. But it's like, oh, okay. So it's somebody who's, has fiduciary responsibility over that. So happens to stay on the security practice as well. Did you find it was like security focused and centric, or was it more like business centric and they were saying, we need as a business to be secure, how can you do it? I often find that people are, hey, we're a security team and we're kind of like, that's our focus. They're like SEAL Team 6. The missions are given, but they're not centered on the mission. It's kind of hard to explain it that way, but
Well, I think everything's business motivated at the end of the day. And in security in particular, there's a balance of like, how much do you want to invest and how much do you want to lock something down, right? It's a very much a give and take between the technical organization and, the desires of the security team to reduce risk or have the data to be able to react properly when things go wrong. And that's predominantly the field of security I always worked in, which is around detection and response. And detection and response is really just a big insurance policy in a lot of ways for companies that don't get attacked very often. But for big companies that are getting attacked every day, it's a necessity. And it really is to protect the business and to protect our data, protect our systems, our employees, our executives, and because they're constantly getting attacked and targeted. And a lot of things are financially motivated. I mean, you can read through, the Verizon DBIR report's quite good at breaking down the categories of attacks and things like that. So it is very business motivated to reduce risk in the business, to protect, and to put the right controls in place that we don't regret later on.
that's an interesting phrasing. I love, because this is one thing that we often forget too in anything we do with automation or anything in IT operations and cloud operations is we have to revisit the things that we're doing today. Like I often say that today's best practices are tomorrow's what the hell were we thinking? Just because
Mm-hmm.
things change, and we've probably seen a lot of like technology change, which one would think like, okay, perfect. We've got these amazing accelerations with AI and technology that we can do, but that doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it probably amplifies the problem. The tools are better, and the platforms on which you can build, a Panther and other platforms are better. However, nothing is solved. We just simply have just maybe changed the veneer of the core problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, SIM has changed a lot in that time, and we've had to adapt based on the environment around us. So everyone's always talking about data volumes continuously increasing, and data is the new gold, especially with training AI models or just being smarter and less like deterministic about the types of logic we want to look for. So it's been an interesting journey to watch that happen and to watch a lot of the legacy tooling kind of fail out by default because it just falls over based on the scale. I mean, the scale that we hear about is, there's some organizations doing petabytes of data per day of just log data, which is kind of
Wow.
mind-blowing to think about how much that is. But, this is some of the biggest tech companies in the world are doing things like that. So you really need to take a very thoughtful approach to what is even the data you need to collect. Because I think at that point, at that massive scale, you have to ask those questions and you have to be very intentional about what are the things I actually care to understand about my threat model and what are the things in my organization I want to prioritize. Because otherwise you could spend infinite dollars and infinite time. And the type of security work that we do is really intentional and important for that. You have to just be very specific about what you care about.
This is the interesting challenge as you look at like data that you're pulling and gathering and instrumenting, like things that you're instrumenting in order to then have, analytics and decision. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's really what we're aiming for, is ideally decision automation, even better,
Yeah.
actionable outcomes that we get from that. And how do we know what's the right data to capture and
Hmm.
not just get caught out where there's a volumetric amount of data that we can pull in, and maybe it's meaningful, not meaningful now, it may be meaningful later, but it's also terrifyingly expensive
Yeah.
for people to just collect and hold a lot of this data over time.
Yeah. I mean, going to intention, it all starts with, what do you care about protecting? What's important for your business to protect? If you take a very easy example, like customer data lives here in this database or this set of systems or whatever else. You're like, okay, that's good to know. We'll label that. That's like our most important thing. What are all the ways that you can go in and out of those systems? Like maybe you have a web application that touches a database. Maybe you have certain folks in the organization and your engineering team who can access that database. And then you basically want to get eyes around multiple layers. So defense in depth is always about getting multiple angles of the same data at different layers. So a very trivial example is if you're looking at application level logs, which is very high level. You can be looking at host level logs, which is people logging into the systems. You can be looking at network traffic logs that tell a different story, and they all sort of are helpful for different parts. Some are more helpful for being proactive because they're very detailed, like application and higher level logs, like layer 7. And then the lower level stuff is for answering very tactical questions around, okay, there's a bunch of data exfilled from that database. How much was let go? Right? Things like that. And I think what it comes down to are most of the time like compliance requirements. What do you have to be logging? A lot of these things are just sort of forced by default. And then there's the next layer of that, which is what do you want to be logging? Like as an additional layer to either improve your detection and response capability or just to be able to be more exhaustive in your answers. And then you sort of balance all this with, okay, what's the volume of signals that we're getting? Are we getting too many alerts? Is that data actually being usable or not? Is the ROI of that high? Um, what's the cost of storing it? There's a lot of these like follow-on downstream questions, but it all goes down to intention in your core threat model. And I think the best teams that I've seen start with that. And a lot of them are actually really good about being essentialists, both in the alerting, the detections, and the data. It's all really important to put together.
What are sort of the golden signals that are ones that you in particular are seeking out that are going to drive the best value? As you said, like once we have intention of understanding of what we're
Mhm.
after, then how do you, as a platform, sort of identify what are better signals to pull and focus on so that you don't end up with just this plethora of data that's just taking up a data lake?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. So we look at statistics across all of our customers because we do threat research on our own data sets based on the supported integrations that we have. So basically the way that our product works is that we are effectively like the heart and soul of a detection team. We are pulling the data in, we're normalizing it, we're running some rules on it, and then we're sending alerts out to wherever our team does their workflow. And we look at the high level metadata of all that all the time, and we see we predominantly look at volume because fidelity is a very subjective thing to measure. Meaning like was the alert valid or not? It's such a gray area because you can be getting an alert. It could be an alert that you actually wanted to get, but it doesn't necessarily mean that an attack or something nefarious happened. It just means that something relevant happened that you need to know about and you
Right.
need to maybe take some follow-up action on. So we predominantly look at volumes. And you can basically guess, you know, using fairly subjective ranges of volume to be like, okay, yeah, that one's actually working out pretty well. If there's ones that are repetitive and consistently repetitive, those are probably not great. We want to turn those off. So we look at the high level stats to determine that. And then we're also looking predominantly in like where in the kill chain are we focusing our efforts. This is the thing that I was just talking with someone on my podcast about yesterday. And he had a really great point. It's this security engineer from Brex, and he was talking about how they just focus on like a really narrow part of the kill chain because everything else is noise. So we try to take that same approach to where like the built-in rules are more centered on like, more important parts of the kill chain, and try to like shut other things off or just kind of label it as like a low pry thing that doesn't really go anywhere, but is labeled in case you need it for IR, incident response.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing then goes, where do we add like anecdotal knowledge? And I think this is one of the gaps we had for the longest time that was always filled by literally just sort of tribal knowledge in the team of, hey, this application behaves this way, so this is stuff to look for. Now looking at how Panther approaches this at a technological layer, how much do you have that's just, core data, and how much is stuff that's additional inference that's human generated?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, this is where a lot of detection as code comes into play. And the reality is that every organization is different. It's different in their business logic, it's different in their threat model, it's different in their technology stack, everything. And there's objectively common behaviors that every org is probably looking at, but then it's the layering on top of that is what makes a system more effective or less effective. So we take a detection as code approach where we have the baseline rules, all of them are open source, and users can effectively add additional logic on top of the baseline that we've created. They can check it into a repo. It's all version controlled, it's all automated, and it's collaborative with their team as well. So that's really the mode of maintaining that tribal knowledge and codifying it. It's just so important. And then that way, as your team evolves, you get more people. It's easy to scale that up. So we've seen a lot of success in that, and that's a pattern that's continued growing in security in general.
Yeah, and this is, I wish that all of IT operations would learn from this bloody lesson, because that's one of the things that we often have, is that the belief that everything is core to the product, but it's actually the rule engine, and that is where the business logic comes in, and there's usually this big gap, and so much is left to the human side of the team to just, all right, we'll give you as much as we can, but good luck and may your God go with you. You deal with the data. And I think that's why security is interesting, that they understood very early, people in security, that just the volume cannot be, it's not tenable at any human scale, period. We're already against the wall. Everything we do is a fight. And it's an interesting position to come from, versus IT operations is just like, whew, all right, not my problem. Like, we very much, I call it MTT NMP, mean time to not my problem. Most of it is around moving hey, it's a database issue, it's a cloud issue, it's a network issue. But in security, there's a very strong sense of ownership that then also changes the way you interact with systems, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So security platforms are used differently than a lot of IT ops platforms.
Sure. And it's a very different context, obviously, as well. People in security are trying to reduce risk, and sometimes we end up buying too many tools that we don't need.
Happens to the best of us. It's all good.
Yeah, it's like tool bingo.
Yeah, well, and to the point of, there's really no way to eliminate it all. This is the single pane of glass myth that happened, especially in ITOM, which was like, hey, I'm going to give you one product that's going to eliminate your need for all these other things. And that never came to fruition. At best, you just added to the portfolio. And I find that security buyers and security users, they don't care about getting rid of the 4 other tools. They care about getting the right outcome, which is such a different buying and value pattern. But at the same time, who do you sell to in security? Because when you talk about security as code and this idea of compliance as code and all of these ideas, the primary champion, your user, is a developer who probably wants as little as possible to do with security, because that's not their primary focus. Their focus is features, business logic. But meanwhile, we require them to participate in the process of security, which is new, I'll say, in their world. So how do you approach, I'll say that like the selling story when you've got obviously a CISO is your economic buyer likely, but your practitioners may not be the people that are in the console of the platform you're selling them.
Well, so the practitioners are in security, by the way. So, and there's a whole title called security engineering, detection engineering. And I think security engineers are typically the folks who work on the application itself. Like if, for example, at Airbnb, security engineers would sit with the actual product teams and make sure that what they were developing was secure and sane and all these things, right? Detection engineering is the other side of that, which is around building logging pipelines and rules and really configuring the SIEM, configuring the response capabilities, and working on optimizing that whole thing. And detection engineers, at least in my experience, start as security analysts. They don't start as software developers. Like that was my exact journey, right? Like I was an intern, a security analyst, a forensic analyst, and then a security engineer, right? So that persona is directly within the realm of the CISO and usually under a manager, like a detection engineering manager or a CCERT manager. It really just varies. A lot of teams are very different, but they are very much in that umbrella. And they're not, because they don't come from that background of like pure software development, it's a very interesting product to build for them, right? Because it's not a 100% dev workflow, and you kind of have to meet in the middle of capability. You don't want to expose too much of the metal because it's probably not the right abstraction layer of technicality that is useful for them or productive for them. So because of that, we sway a little bit more towards like some abstraction, but not too much to where they can't get in and like change things and mold it for them. But yeah, we sell predominantly into CISOs, managers, and things like that, people like that.
Now, how do you help them, I guess, help their customer in that case, which would be the actual, the software engineers who are building code that we want to build secure coding practices, secure development practices, secure deployment practices. So I guess it's an interesting thing that you may not be selling to the developer or showing the output to the developer, but you're guiding behaviors that are going to occur
Right.
in a development team.
That's true.
So what are sort of the tools and practices that you found effective in your champions being able to tell that story and affect change inside the organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it comes down to the why of why someone did something is bad. So like someone actually just told me about this the other day, someone who works at a company that uses our product, and they're like, oh yeah, we got some exposure to Panther because we got an alert that we were doing something bad in production and Panther told us to stop. A lot of it has to do with just exposing the SIEM to the greater organization and allowing them to get in and see the details. And then for someone in security, or maybe the alert itself just explains, hey, this is a bad practice because XYZ, like next time do this. So there's certainly an element of getting the organization exposed, both on the alerting side and potentially the data side as well.
Because one of the things I've used to always see people struggle with, we talked about, DevOps was a thing. I suppose it still is as a general practice, but then somebody said at one point it was like DevSecOps, and I think that was probably a term that was lit by somebody rightly in the security practice. Is like, hey, we need to get involved here. And then a lot of people got really upset because they're like, why do we have to so explicitly name it? And it was like, well, because we didn't explicitly do it. It's like everybody assumed that someone else was handling it or that it was at the end of the chain. And that is absolutely where the pain. I used to feel this, early days of, we would do a pen test right before it went to production. And you're like, that's bizarre in today's practices. Like, we should be on first code commit. We should be inherently doing security as a practice inside everything. But it was, as much as we think it's part of daily practice in software building now, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are. You probably have way more understanding of the data and the size of the problem. How much code is secure code these days, and how many practices are secure practices, other than
I
not
don't
enough?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have enough context to answer that question, as I haven't been inside an organization working on that for a while. So not my area of expertise necessarily right now.
I like that. I like that good answer. The best answer is like, I don't want to give you an answer that I can't back up. But
100%.
I'll guess on the other side, I ask this: you've got a ton of data, and you talk about you can derive a lot across your customers.
Hmm.
What surprising patterns have you seen emerge that even maybe your team was learned about and adjusted to as you saw more and more data coming in and being able to see what was actually going on?
Oh man, I I think my customers would kill me if I answered that question. So I'm
That's
not
just
going
true. That's
to.
true. But I guess I'll say, as a practice, as a foundation of how you built the platform and the company,
Hmm.
that is a distinct advantage over somebody trying to go it alone, right? A lot of people will say, yep, there's tons of open source solutions, there's tons of things
Yeah.
we can do. But moving to a platform that has a broader view and a broader set of data to derive knowledge from, I guess that's really where I want to go, is like, you have an advantage over anybody in a single silo implementation. Deploy this, your own standalone solution is great, but they are only as knowledgeable as the things it touches, versus with Panther
Hmm.
now, that customer has everybody else's learning that's now potentially going to derive value for them. So how did you, as you built the platform and you looked at how do we bring knowledge back into the core, that's a complex challenge,
Hmm.
to do that securely and obviously and securely and safely, but also to add the most value for every customer. So what was your ethos as you built the platform wrapped around that idea?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's most amazing about building a product and having users is that they inspire you to solve the problem in new ways. And it's the same way of hiring a great team. They emerge with a different perspective based on their experience, and they solve problems in better ways. And putting all that knowledge together and getting the, sort of spreading that benefit into the customer base has been one way I think that we've taken customer feedback and ran with it. So we launched a new version of our search product last year, and we got a lot of great feedback. We incorporated that in, and we're continuously working on products based on customer feedback and our own team's inspiration of how they think to best solve that problem for them. And then we'll roll that out. We'll get some quick feedback. We'll incorporate it. We'll think about something, they'll inspire us to think about something new that we didn't think about when we built it. And then now you have a new capability that's sort of rinsed and repeated across the entire customer base. So that's been really inspiring and really remarkable to watch happen.
One thing that definitely stands out in even the way you describe the problems and development in the company is you're very customer centric and customer focused, or customer obsessed, I guess is the Bezos phrase that, I'm sure it wasn't just him that
Hmm.
said it. But so it seems as though you knew right away that deep involvement with customers and listening was going to be the most helpful thing for guiding platform growth. So how do you
100%.
spend, like, how do you build a listening team as you're doing product development?
I think in the early cycles, it's just spending time with the customer at really critical points. So when you get on the first call and the second call, maybe you do a demo, there's always a lot of follow-on questions folks have, and that's when you kind of get in the mind of what problems are they trying to solve. And then you triangulate that with what are we trying to solve, and then sort of course correct based on that. And then once they become customers, the first few months are really critical as well when they start to adopt. And it's the same sort of thing, um, being very careful to watch all of the feedback and act on it very quickly. right? Because you want people to have a good experience from, the first few months. And honestly, that first year is really important because, one of my board members has always said, oh, the first year is a trial, right? You have to win their business continuously every year. And you do that by being receptive to their feedback, being there when they need support, which is something that we've heard a lot of positive feedback on. Our support team's excellent. And just reacting and evolving, right? Like, because people want to watch evolution happen. And in every startup, no product is complete in the beginning. There's always things you need to fill in over time. And as long as you show that progression with your customer base, that's one of the things that motivates them to continue working with us. So yeah, just the critical touch points, checking in. You can do customer advisory boards, things like that, roadmap presentations. But I've always found that even in the sales cycle and the early customer cycle, if you stick with them very consistently, you'll get a lot of the right signals to incorporate back in.
Now that's a fun. Actually, I love that phrase that the first year is a trial because it's funny. We really do think like, oh yeah, once it's now a renewal problem, and sometimes you'll even like a lot of companies build. They have a second desk that handles renewals. Like you'll find that they move account reps. Like that's a future me problem. Is sort of the meme that we say. But as you built that organization, then that must have changed how you built the company because you had to have a real end-to-end customer, retention flow and customer listening flow probably fairly early on. So did you have that organization's kind of like built for scaling across the whole thing? Where did you put your focus in those early hires?
The early hires were just filling critical gaps across the board. So hiring folks for sales and marketing. I mean, a lot of it was just engineering hiring in the beginning, and maybe one or two small like marketing, field marketing, product marketing types of things. And then there was a phase where we had rapid customer growth. So we're like, okay, we need to build a customer success org. We need to build our sales org out, our marketing org out, and just kind of like went into that crazy growth mode. And since then, we've learned a lot of what works and what doesn't work and have, evolved the organization accordingly to that. So, but yeah, the early days, it was really just a huge, like 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 on figuring out like, how are we going to support all these customers in a way that we can continue to, renew them year over year. So that was a fun journey.
Yeah, well, and I don't think how much I'll say how much surprised you about every day that occurred. As a founder myself, I'm like, every time you think you got it sorted out, you get reminded about 14 minutes later that we're all on the same roller coaster. Just I may have a better sense of I'm closer to the front of the car so I can see what's going on.
Yeah. You learn that you don't know much every year. Like you think and then you don't. You're like, oh, that's new. Okay. Someone on my board always says, or he doesn't always say it, but he has a quote that stuck with me, which is like, we only want to make new mistakes. And I love that. It's a great phrase.
It's I mean, the funny thing is like, talk about timing. You've like every series of black swans has occurred in the time that you've been building this team.
It's
And
true. At least in the last 10 years.
is I often think like how much of this is repeatable. Like I kind of worry that we're in a bespoke lesson world every day these days.
Yeah, very true. To be prepared for anything.
Now, the next thing is because if you how many other places you gather and potentially send data and knowledge, partner ecosystem and partner integrations is a tough one, especially as an early stage startup. Spending your efforts in engineering, co-engineering and co-marketing, it's very easy to get lost in like, oh, let's come up with 10 partners because that'll open up account access. But that's a tough balance. So how did you approach where your integration points are at a technology layer, as well as maybe even on the business side?
Yeah. Early on, it was just based on the architecture that we had built on top of. So AWS and Snowflake were really key ones and still are to this day. And showcasing the capabilities together. I remember doing a podcast, or not podcast, a webinar with Snowflake very early on, and it was kind of mind blowing because Snowflake was really innovating on the database side and a little bit more than we had seen in other parts of the industry. So we really spent a lot of time building with them and optimizing, and we still do, a lot together with Snowflake. And Amazon is similar. We've been partnering with them from a go-to-market perspective. And I think what it really comes down to is how do you want to distribute your software and who is closest to your customer,
Right.
right? And then making sure that we're aligned on the same go-to-market motion. Like your sellers are going after the same people we're going after, and just building that relationship and that business relationship, in addition to a technology relationship, is super important to like make that very fruitful in the long run. And I'd say focus is important here too. Like you don't want too many. I mean, you really only have maybe one distribution model that's core. So really building that relationship up is important. And you can do it on many layers. You can do it on like the technical layer. You can do it on the leadership level. You can do it in go to market, like all these different things.
Yeah, and that becomes the fun part of your distribution model and how you're going to connect with that customer. That becomes an interesting challenge because we've got obviously even some of the most smooth SaaS implementations often still have a bonus, services opportunity where we can get, higher levels of adoption. And so there's a potential partner ecosystem to light up some, services partners. But again, like that's also a risky thing early on where do are you turning over knowledge? Are you turning over account control to some of these other partners? So, how did you focus early on where the services and post sales implementation stuff would live?
We didn't do it for a while. I think because early on, when you don't have product repeatability yet, it's hard to just give that to a services provider and be like, okay, go do this. I think when you're in rapid iteration mode, it doesn't work well. Once you hit a critical mass of stability, then I think it becomes more like scalable to do that.
Yeah.
And we had a few MSPs using us early on, and we've been going deeper into that ecosystem now that we've been in the market for several years. So again, it's just focusing on a few of the key relationships, making sure that they work and are repeatable, and then moving on to others that are very like-minded. And there's a handful that we've been partnering quite closely with recently. That's been great. We really enjoyed it.
I guess looking at your own personal experience and where you came from before then, you worked at pretty high scale organizations and high scale technology teams. Did you, how important was scalability versus like functionality in what you were trying to solve? SIEM works at massive scale, but that in itself is a monstrous problem, and you can get caught out over engineering a solution, or then you could cut on the other side where you're like, I have a functional problem that I'm solving, but then this platform may not scale.
Well, yeah, that was always the problem in SIEM, by the way, was the second, the last thing you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was starting with the fundamental problem that we need to solve is cost and scale and more control around how we want to analyze our data. Because at that point in time, in the late 2010s, it was becoming all about data lakes and big data and all of that because of the intelligence you can derive at that scale. And you've seen this in BI, business intelligence, forever, right? Massive data warehouses, harvesting information, and then using that to make business decisions. We're doing the same thing in security now. And a lot of those fundamentals have to make their way into security around data pipelines, data engineering, scalability, cost considerations, ETL, like all of these different things. And now obviously training AI models and LLMs and Gen AI. And so there's been quite a lot of advancement there. But everything that we do at Panther was really centered around the concept of detection as code and scalability, because we knew that those were things that we needed to support like modern security operations teams that want longevity in their programs.
What would you describe then as sort of the fundamentals of SIEM and you should be rightly biased because obviously you're building around it. But
Yeah.
what are the core fundamentals in the same way we think of, we've got golden signals of Kubernetes and we've got
Hmm.
core practices in this. What is the purpose and the reason for a SIEM to need to exist?
Oh, I mean, there's a multitude of reasons. You won't be able to see anything happening in your organization if you don't have one. It's the first thing. You won't pass a lot of compliance standards as well if you don't have it, which is probably the most important thing to the business. PCI, HIPAA, ISO 27001, SOC 2, all those things. So there's just a core need for it from pretty early days, even on the most basic level. You just need to collect your data and you need to have an audit trail of the sensitive things going on in the organization. That's just the core need. And then when it comes down to the components of that, how you actually operationalize it, based on what we were saying around scale, data pipeline is now a core requirement of this in modern organizations that have a lot of data, which is everybody. And after that, it's, I'll be biased and say a detection as code system because that's really what we center on. But even putting us aside, that's just a pattern that we see in general. We see all types of organizations adopting it because it allows you to codify the business logic into the rules. It allows you to have a more collaborative practice with your team. It allows you to have reliability, which is probably one of the most important things. We don't want a SIEM that's running that's untested. Like any production software, we want high testability and high coverage. So a lot of those paradigms flow from software development, which is a key component of detection as code. And then the other side of that is how do you respond in a way that's very quick and scalable? I think scalable is probably the key word here, both from like a team and cost perspective. So a lot of things we talked about before around being intentional about what things you're collecting. There's a huge push now for like tiering your data and filtering your data. And again, a lot of these are pipelining concepts. These aren't new things. They've just now made their way into security.
Right.
And we just see that those components of like a pipeline, a detection as code system, something that's backed by data lakes or something that's very scalable, you can integrate with training AI models and things like that, and then responding in a very like repeatable, scalable way. And we sort of see those core components often configured in many different types of ways.
The data thing is definitely, and of course, AI being the new buzzword of the new acai berry of technology here, that it's the new superfood. So everybody's AIing everything and Gen AI. But as much as there's technological advancement, there's I'd say significantly more risk that's coming along with these advancements, especially around like data retention, even like building internal systems that we've got. Like I'm having to build in right to be forgotten capabilities in vector stores. Like that's really gnarly when you think about the cost and technical debt of being able to retrain models if there's a data problem. Like there's stuff that we never thought we'd have to experience, or even worse, that maybe that a lot of people don't know. So when it comes to, data pipelines and AI data and the sort of the growth of people putting way too much data in ChatGPT, what do you see as this next wave of risk that people are about to discover?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of red teaming happening on models to break them, right? And I think we all know the consequences of that. Like you just made a joke about people putting too much into ChatGPT and then someone prompting the model to get that information about some big organization that may have done that. So, I mean, on LLMs and Gen AI, like that's the risk, is that they're used for nefarious purposes. Like people have done and published a lot of research that, allow them to jailbreak the model, basically.
Yeah.
So preventing things like that is really important. And then in addition to how you just mentioned the data privacy perspective. But the beauty is that there's a lot of really amazing open source models that are becoming super popular, like Claude, for example, and they compete quite well with OpenAI's models. So I think that's the most fascinating part of this, is thinking about the democratization of those models, those foundation models, and then sort of like watching where they pop up in all these other places. Like I know Facebook had also done some open source here too, but the ecosystem's exciting. I think I'm personally more excited than I am pessimistic or afraid of it. I think the advancements we'll continue to see in the next few years are going to be mind-blowing. And there's just such a huge potential for significantly improving our comprehension of the world around us with it, or creating new solutions that couldn't have existed before because of it. So that's where I'm most excited. And the open source side of it is really encouraging to watch happen. So it's not just monopolized by Microsoft, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and this is I mean we see even the battle that's going on in the licenses that are applied to stuff. People even going on about OpenAI should change their name because it is not open, but more like open source in a truly open fashion. Because we've even seen it in broad software adoption. Redis was one example where because of some of the difficulty they ran into they had an AWS challenge, and AWS had a service. So along came the AGPL, and there's MGPLs. There's lots of modified GPLs that give a little bit more protection. The idea that it could be used, but not commercially. And then, literally as the day we're recording, we saw there's Valkey was the new platform that's now a new, Redis alternative. And I don't mean to call it Redis. It's just it came to mind, but that's a case where we're going to see this now in the open source models, where even something that's going to be really fantastic in GPT-5, we're likely going to see Claude 5 by then as well. That's going to be doing pretty fantastic stuff. Like the jump from Claude, 2 to 3 or whatever the naming structure we've got of it, like that just came out that last week.
Mm-hmm.
They're making huge changes and huge advancements.
Yeah.
Now,
And it's becoming cheaper too.
right. And I guess that's the interesting thing. Now, for you, looking at what more you can do with AI, how much does AI seem as an opportunity internally, and what you can do with existing data that you're already capturing maybe?
Oh, it's a huge opportunity. We've already done a lot of projects on it, and we'll probably release something around the RSA conference that sort of dips our toe into the water here as an early way. So I'm excited. I think there's just so much potential to improve the life of analysts and engineers. And the thing I've always thought with AI is like it gets you 80% of the way there. You sort of fill in the 20, and then that allows you to free your mind up to do the more important things. It's like, I have a Tesla, and like most San Francisco-based founders, it has autopilot, and autopilot does exactly that, right? I'm driving on the highway. I turn it on, I shut my brain off to this. I don't have as much attention on the task anymore because I've trusted another system to do it for me. And I think that's kind of the promise of AI is similar. It's like, okay, I want you to edit this for me. I want you to, take this mundane task that I was doing repetitively and automate it for me. And a lot of times it does it better because it has access to so much reference data.
Right.
So I think in security, it's just there's a huge opportunity to use it. I just want to make sure that we use it in the right ways. AI and ML has been thrown around in InfoSec for so long, and in a lot of ways, people don't trust it because abnormalities is a common. It's just a common everyday practice in human behavior. Like humans are certainly creatures of habit, but humans can also deviate from those habits, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad.
Right.
And I think a lot of systems that we've built in security just auto dictate, oh, that's bad. And then what ends up happening is we look at it for 1 second and we're like, no, it's not. It's fine. Model just doesn't know that we do this thing every Saturday, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, and that becomes the interesting challenge of anything to do with detection is that there's random anomalous behavior, there's periodic behavior, there's systemic behavior, there's seemingly a random behavior. Like that's always the hardest part is that what looks like one thing, when you actually connect enough of the back end systems together and a broader understanding, we think we're looking at the problem, but we're actually looking at the results. The problem happened a long time ago. As a practice, you're a very optimistic person for a security person. So looking at your industry, and the events, how do you find the tone of security communities now compared to when you came up as a practitioner?
That's a good question. I haven't been to the conferences this year, so once that happens, I'll have a more informed answer. But I think just mostly people are embracing the new capabilities of Gen AI and things like that. And yeah, I'm not a skeptical security person as much anymore. I think I haven't been a practitioner for 5, 6 years, but I think if you talk to me then I probably would be.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I've been paying a lot of attention to more of the AI community in general and just watching things there. And of course, I pay attention to the big security companies and what they're working on. Yeah, I just see a lot of the same embracing new tech, embracing a more holistic, risk-based approach, and doing what we can to harness the technology in really interesting ways to make our jobs easier and to protect our organizations. So generally just focused on that versus complaining about things.
Yeah, well, it's very easy for us to get caught in that. And, but again, I think as a community of practice, security people are what people think they're like strange. They're oddly guarded. I'm like, well, that's natural. It's in because you're looking at the world through a different lens of what you're caring about. But at the same time, I find they're very collegial and very open to sharing information amongst each other. There's even looking at like RSA it's a big conference, but very seldom do I really think about the fact that RSA is a brand, a company, like versus AWS reInvent. It's all you think about is like it's their money, it's their thing. But RSA, I've really see the human side of the conference is so much stronger than a lot of other vendorized conferences. And then of course you get into Black Hat and even down to B-sides, like the regional stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They're very human centric, and that's just always been the most fascinating thing. They're the most tool loving folks, but they're also the most human understanding folks. It's an interesting dichotomy of the way that is versus ITOM and IT ops folks, which is my angry bunch that I grew up in. We're the trolls under the bridge that just inherently distrust other people. But security folks, you distrust products and you trust people. It's an interesting thing.
Yeah. The conference circuit's fun. It's fun to see what new things are out there. It's fun to hear on the other side how practitioners are getting value from those things. And I think conferences like B-Sides and DEF CON allow you to see the other side. I mean, Black Hat and RSA are like 100% vendor conferences. And as practitioners, I always used to ignore those. I always used to just be like, I don't want to get sold to, you know. So it's funny. I always just didn't want to go to those conferences. And now as a founder, it's like those are things that I look forward to every year, just to see other founder friends, to connect with new companies, to partner with new companies. That's how we've made some of our partnerships. It's just being on the floor and talking to people and making friends and working together. It's been fun.
Yeah, finding birds of feather. It's funny, I guess that maybe that's me. Like my lens was so different that I never really saw the brand attachment as strongly because I was outside of interfacing with those brands directly. So
Hmm.
that's interesting that you brought that up. Um, Now, what's your advice? Yeah, so Jack 2.0, 18, going to university, ready to make decisions about future life, likes security. What do you tell that person? What are those people? What advice would you give to help them towards their path in this industry?
In security, in like
Yeah,
protection,
yeah.
I'd say learn to code, learn how to be a developer, learn how to like run software, learn how to set up infrastructure, just kind of understand how the system works, like know how the sausage is made to a degree. And then as you do that and you get some practical experience, like you'll figure out where to go next. But I always found that in school, it's all just so conceptual and, it's I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here, but by learning how to actually build the system or to set up a system or really just like how something works to its core, like that gives you a different fundamental set of knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise get. And you have to consistently do this year over year. So now with Gen AI, it's like, okay, learn how fundamentally an LLM works, right? Basically, right? Because
Yeah.
you need to know how it works to get the value from it from a certain context perspective. And prompt engineering is one of those things where, to take that example further, if you don't know how to prompt the model, like you're not going to really be able to use it. So as you learn how to prompt the model, how the model can get more contextual, then you sort of apply that in a context of something like security or specifically like triaging an alert or understanding what this event is actually saying. And just repeating that over your career as whatever new thing comes up, new cloud provider, new technology that's really helpful for solving some type of problem. Just kind of like go into the weeds of it, learn about it,
Yeah.
and always be learning, always be open to growth. Like just read books every month. Um, and yeah, I'm a very growth-oriented person in general. So that would be my advice is just to be a sponge forever. Just continuously learn. Don't make the same mistake twice. Um, and yeah,
I like that. We only want to make new mistakes.
right.
That's such a fantastic phrase. And so looking at, because you are growth oriented and you have a heavy responsibility as a founder and a
Hmm.
builder and a community representative, and you're furthering the people of this industry and the community of practice, where do you feel that you wish you could spend more time?
Hmm. I think doing more community focused work is an area that I'm planning to spend more time in, but really just replaying the story of others has been really fun. I mean, I have a podcast myself. It's called Detection at Scale. I'm going to plug it just because I think it helps folks understand a little bit of the context of the work that I do and what we do as a company. It's not at all an advertisement for Panther. It's all about the people who are in the field working on the problems. And we talk about solutioning and things like that, but it's really just centered around what it's like to be in that role and some of the challenges and some of the really interesting solutions people have come up with there. So yeah, just being more outward, writing more, taking a lot of the knowledge that, I've had being a founder and sort of like spreading that through and teaching others how to be better at detection and response. So that's an area I'm going to spend some more time in.
Have you found really good sort of study methods or even, communities of practice that have been helpful for you on that journey?
Hmm. Talking with customers is really helpful, but I've learned a lot through just hearing people on sales calls talk about solving their problem. So like, I've written a few blogs as well on Substack about the various ways of like driving down false positives, for example. And a lot of that just comes from my experience of being around a lot of these people. Talking to them on the podcast is a huge source of that inspiration. Reading other articles. I think just in general, security articles tend to be so buzzwordy and surface level. So like one of my goals is to like write it out and be exhaustive. And I do that by using a combination of things like LLMs to ask basic questions. And then I look at how vendors have talked about it in the past. I look at other tools and just kind of triangulate and be like, okay, how are we all collectively trying to solve this in a lot of different ways? And then talk about it. Because it's hard to have the nuance. That
Yeah.
nuance is really difficult, especially if you're looking at other tools and trying to differentiate, like, okay, this tool does the same type of thing, slightly different. What does that actually mean for my capability of that? And then how's it compared to this other tool? So it can actually help people reason about using the best tool to solve their problem, which is another hope that I have is that people just kind of get the context and they understand it, and then they can take advantage of the technology around them.
Yeah, and this is the one thing that I find as a practitioner I used to get stuck on is that I would have a bunch of bunch of tools that I'm using 30% of. And it
Hmm.
was really difficult to invest the focus in getting the most out of each platform and maybe even finding efficiencies that I could get by, either doing more with something or even maybe even eliminating stuff that's in the chain. It's, I'm with you on like keep learning and find a peer group, and selfishly, I started the podcast so I could find amazing folks like you, Jack, and like learn these things and it worked out that when I started listening to other podcasts and I always gravitated towards ones that were conversational, people in similar areas. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess it's a podcast in practice of, finding other founders but yet technically focused. So it's neat to be able to split the line between those things.
Yeah.
What's your book of choice this month?
It has kind of a funny title. I bought it in the airport when I was flying back to San Francisco recently. It's How to Make a Few Billion Dollars.
Nice, nice.
It's a pretty good read. It's about this serial entrepreneur who started all these different businesses throughout his life, and just the lessons that he's learned through that. It's a fun read. Um, I also have let's see, what else am I reading right now? I'm reading a book called Happier No Matter What. That one's really good.
Oh,
It's kind
okay,
of like,
cool.
I don't know if you've heard of Anti-Fragile. That's like
Yes,
very
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's adjacent to that.
Okay, cool.
That book's been good so far. I always typically have like 2, 3 books open. Just kind of, maybe I'm listening to Audible as well.
One of
So
my favorite like random things I learned a couple years ago is the idea that like in Audible and in Kindle, I had no idea that they were synced.
mhm.
So I'd be like, I would open my Kindle and like, this looks exactly where I left off on the audiobook. And then if I finally realized like, oh wow, what a great way to pair off, especially when there was PDFs and examples. I'm like, oh, I can stop here, bust open the Kindle, see it in tandem with where I am. Like, ah,
It's pretty
and
sweet.
yeah, and just especially with flying and driving, it's anytime I can pop on something and be learning it, it feels good. And quickly, let's say to merge two things. I just wrote an article that's about to launch right in line with what you talked about. When I said Panther #1. I love the platform and the approach, beautifully simple in the way you describe it, but I know the complexity of the problem you're solving. Your team is fantastic, and your way of telling the story is really, really good. And I love people who are not just like, we're the greatest thing ever, we're game changing, industry leading, what all the hyphenated buzzwords. Your humility in your approach to it means a lot. As somebody who, when I look to other founders for lessons, I really like your approach. But let's go to cooking, because I say every piece of content that I generate, I called it, how do you create Michelin star content? And so I looked
That's
at
so funny.
Daniel Hum, who's the head chef and owner of 11 Madison
Mm,
in New York, and I've been lucky enough to go there. My partner, she and I went there a couple of times, and he says the 4 fundamentals for a true dish, and I think this tells your story of even a startup or a platform or a thing. #1, the dish has to be delicious. It seems obvious, but it's actually got to be. You have to think about it. #2, the dish has to be beautiful.
mm.
So it is amazing that people say presentation doesn't matter. So if that was the case, there'd be sushi milkshakes. It's not the case. The third is creativity. So every dish should add to the dialogue of food. And I thought that was such a great way of this extending the vocabulary of cuisine with something we do. And then to something you mentioned so strongly throughout this, intention. It needs to make sense that this dish exists. And from spending even very short amount of time with you, Jack, you have intention, and I'm proud for all that you've done, and thank you for sharing time and your story and your lessons today. So for folks that want to check it out, of course, go to panther.com and make sure you check out the platform and the podcast. What's the fastest way to get to the podcast? And also, if folks want to reach out and connect with you, Jack.
My podcast is called Detection at Scale, and I also have a Substack that's called that same thing. And then on Twitter, now called X,
Yeah.
Jack underscore Naglieri, just my first underscore last name. And yeah, like you said, the website panther.com, reach out to us there. We have a Slack channel too for folks that use the platform and want to chat with each other. So it's been really fun. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and
thanks for
it's
having me.
the more folks I see from your team is that you make fantastic hiring decisions. So your people represent you very well, and it's a tough thing knowing that hiring is a challenge, running a business is a challenge. I'm looking forward to seeing more and more updates. Good luck with all the conferences coming up, and
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
hopefully
you.
we can catch up again in future and hear more about how things are progressing.
Yeah, that'd be great. One thing I'm going to add, you mentioned 11 Madison Park Ave. Will
Yeah.
Guidara has a book called Unreasonable Hospitality as well.
Ooh.
You should check that out if you haven't. It's pretty good.
That is awesome. Yeah, and it's funny. Like I've some of my best books. When people ask me, like, "How did you get good at technology?" It's like, "What's the book that you recommend about learning how to deal with technology and telling the stories in tech evangelism?" And I said, my most profound learning was from DSM-4, which is now DSM-5. I learned about
Whoa.
how people break, so that I learned about how people work. And most of my study is behavioral psychology
Hmm.
and engagement. And it just so happens that my dad was in tech, and so I grew up around it. I was a database developer when I was 15, but then I
Hmm.
went down a very different path, did retail, I was a cobbler, I did all sorts of strange things along the way, and then came back to tech. And so I love non-tech books that have a surprising impact on my technology work, and it sounds like that's exactly the kind of book that I'm going to love.
There's two things. One, I'm the opposite. My dad is a psychologist and I'm a technologist. And the other thing is that if you want to look for really good startup advice in a non-startup book, read The Design of Everyday Things.
Fantastic.
That book's amazing.
I owe you so much just from all these book recos. This is fantastic. So
We
hey
could just,
Jack,
yeah.
this is really really cool, and I thank you. I love your approach to all this stuff, and this has been super awesome. So
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
very cool, excellent. Well, there you go, folks. I got a book list for you. I got a lot of reading to do ahead. Well, with that, thanks very much, Jack. And yeah, definitely for folks, follow the links that are in the show notes and do check out the platform because I've rarely seen somebody that does it in what they say and actually see it show up in the platform. So great work.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.